Consider the paradox of man's ingenuity. To be able to design and manufacture such magnificent aircraft to serve such a macabre purpose, and then to waste them away as if peace had rendered them useless. They were conceived in an era that fired the imagination of a world at war. And now, decades after it has ended, it is an era that some are trying desperately to piece together again. Wedged neatly into one of the hangars at Hamilton Civic Airport is what is known to many as a dreamland of airplanes, men, and memories. It is an organization bound to the seemingly endless task of sifting through one shapeless mass of warplane wreckage to another in the hope that something might be salvaged from it all.
Back in 1969 or 1970, Alan Ness and I were discussing ways and means of acquiring a P-51 Mustang. We were both float plane pilots, basically, and had decided that we wanted to get into something a little more exciting. In pursuing the Mustang, we found that at that time we just couldn't afford it. The next step would be to acquire an aircraft that was restorable, where we could put a little bit of money in it at a time and come up with a viable fighter when we were finished. We heard about a Fairey Firefly that was in Australia, and at that time didn't even know that Canadians had flown them. In pursuing the Firefly, we found out that there was one even closer to home, that being in Wadley, Georgia, a little town outside of Augusta. We went down and took a look at it and found it was a viable restoration project, brought it up to Toronto, and a year later had it flying. Well, that was the start of it. We became involved with various people around the world that were acquiring these aircraft and restoring them, and found out that a lot of the aircraft that were being restored originated in Canada and were being taken down into the States and various other countries for restoration. Nobody was doing it here. We decided that the only way that we could make a viable entity out of a group such as we had would be to bring a lot of outside money in and to expand it so that we could encompass all aircraft used by Canadians in World War II, both in training and combat. And to this end, we set up what we presently have, Canadian Warplane Heritage, a registered foundation.
The Harvard 4 is one of the easier aircraft to acquire and restore, simply because it was used as late as the mid-1950s by the Royal Canadian Air Force. Most of them have gone south to the United States now, and that's where the Warplane Heritage finds a great number of its parts for them. But memories of the Harvard have lingered long in Canada, ever since the days when they were known to many as the Yellow Peril.
Well, I suppose the Harvard was really the most famous of all the RCAF service flying trainers, along with the Aberranson and the Cessna Crane. The Harvard was responsible for training at an advanced stage thousands and thousands of Canadians. Basically, the Harvard was the aircraft used to train fighter pilots. Now, this didn't mean that everyone who graduated with his wings on a Harvard went to fighters, but basically it was the fighter trainer. Pilots generally went to airplanes like the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Hurricane, the P-40, and so on, whereas the twins, of course, they went to the bombers and the coastal reconnaissance and so on. But it has been said, and I think it's a justifiable comment, that if you can fly a Harvard, you can fly just about anything.
We're just going to go up to 4,000 feet. We'll level at 4. Okay, I've got the lead. Okay, yellow section, Vic, please. Vic formation, go. Okay, yellow section. Number 2, you okay? Number 3? Okay, yellow section. Break now. And now. And now. And line astern, please. Line astern. And I'm turning to the right. Turning to the right. Compensate.
The Harvard is an inherently unstable airplane, as fighter aircraft are. And as I say, if you can fly a Harvard, you can fly a Spitfire, you can fly a Hurricane, you can fly a Mustang.
Okay, yellow section. Number 2, you okay? Number 3? Okay, yellow section. Break now. And now. And now. And line astern, please. Line astern. And I'm turning to the right. Turning to the right. Compensate.
The Harvard is an inherently unstable airplane, as fighter aircraft are, and as I say, if you can fly a Harvard, you can fly a Mustang. I spent hours in the back seat of a Harvard during the war instructing embryo fighter pilots.
Yellow section, let's go over to tower now, 125.0. 1250 switch. Okay, fine. We're going home.
Well, I flew with the number 1 fighter squadron, which became 401, and we were stationed in numerous stations in Britain, and were involved in sweeps, aggressive attacks over the channel against the enemy aircraft and gun positions. We flew Spits and Hurricanes mostly, and did some fighter cover for bombers on their flights in daytime, which were few early in the war. Most of the fellows, in fact, practically all the fellows in our squadron were Canadians, though there were a couple of Americans that later went with the Eagle Squadron. We flew with fellows like Bader and Tuck and Jamie Rankin and Johnny Johnson, who led the wings in the various attacks and sorties into France. Restoration of aircraft is part of the problem, but finding them is another problem. Most of the ones we've been finding are in what we call basket cases. They're so beat up that it takes a terrific amount of restoration work. We have to go all over the world for parts, and of course we sometimes get surplus parts, and we swap with other people who are in the same business in England and Ireland and places like that. In the case of the Seafire, we found that in a dump in the East Coast, and we brought it up here, and of course there were hardly any parts really that we needed, the small parts. And in our search, we found a bunch of pitot heads, which is a thing that controls the airspeed. And the English lost one of their aircraft in an accident. It was a ground loop, and it was the Battle of Britain Spitfire. And they couldn't fly because they had no pitot head. We had a spare one. We sent it over to them, and about 4 weeks or 5 weeks later, at about 1,900 pounds of various parts for the Seafire turned up in Canada for us. So it's a great exchange proposition, but it does take time, and it takes a lot of work, and that's what the boys are involved in every weekend, slugging through mountains of debris to put it together to make it look like something.
The effort put forth by the CWH membership has been impressive. It is here that the odd assortment of aircraft that have either weathered decades of neglect or survived brutal forced landings undergo a startling transformation. Although mostly confined to a flight training capacity, wood and fabric aircraft were not at all uncommon throughout the war. And for this reason, the Canadian Warplane Heritage has endeavored to construct a replica of the one aircraft where it all began for many wartime flyers, the de Havilland Tiger Moth. Thousands of Canadians made their first solo flights in this little two-seater biplane when it was used by the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan as the chief elementary flight trainer. Canada built some 2,000 of them, with modifications to suit our climate and our needs. Top speed was roughly 109 miles per hour, but for the neophyte pilot, all that mattered was that it would get you up there where you could hear the wind in the wires. The acquisition and restoration of World War II fighter aircraft is by no means a small undertaking.
I would guess that to date we've spent something in excess of 3,000 man-hours on the airplane. And probably be another 3,000 to 5,000 to finish it off. Well, this particular airplane we found in Halifax, and it had sort of been salvaged from a garbage dump. And we trucked it back up here, and to date, we've replaced over 5,000 rivets and about 80% of the skin on the airplane. We've gathered parts from all over the world, and we're slowly but surely piecing the thing back together again. With this type of construction, we've had to drill off the old skins, which were badly corroded and full of holes. We've used those as patterns to cut new skins and drill new skins, and then we've re-riveted them back onto the structure.
It is clear that such an operation must be costly. Yet in the complicated business of collecting airplanes that are often easier forgotten than found, they have succeeded by appealing to those individuals who share their feelings about these aircraft and want to become involved. Their most ambitious undertaking to date has been the restoration of a Mitchell B-25 bomber. It is the first large-scale twin-engine aircraft to come into the warplane heritage sphere, and it is the end result of keen snooping by Dennis Bradley and his associates.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, we decided we needed a multiple-seat aircraft to enable us to take all the workers for a ride, if you like. We had a lot of people working on these aircraft. We needed something that we could put them all in and go up. Plus, we needed something to enter the multi-engine part of the Canadian Armed Forces history, and decided the B-25 was the aircraft for us. We checked around through the States, and particularly after some of the aircraft that were used in the Catch-22 movie, there were 30-odd B-25s made serviceable for that movie. But we discovered this particular aircraft in Wilmington, Delaware, sitting in really a derelict state at the back of an airport. It had been used up till the year previously as an executive transport, but had been let go. We negotiated with the fellow that owned it, bought it, sent a crew down, and they spent 5 days getting it serviceable. The aircraft was flown up one Sunday afternoon, and with a great deal of hurrah here at the airport, because it was a big red-letter day. The aircraft is well on its way to restoration at this time. We've got new engines for it. The executive interior, I guess, would have been the next biggest job, tearing it all out, getting all the support members out, and going back to a military interior.
Like each aircraft in the CWH collection, the B-25 will be lovingly restored to its exact original flying condition, using the manufacturer's own specifications as a guide. This type of aircraft was used by Canadians in the European theater in World War II, during which time it saw considerable action. Later, in post-war life, it was used as a navigation trainer and a radar trainer, and established a most enviable service record coast to coast in Canada. The radios are good, the landing gear, the hydraulic systems, all in excellent shape. The engines that are on this aircraft, however, are runouts in Canadian terms, meaning that according to federal regulations, they have exceeded their safe operating limit of 600 hours. As unlikely as it may seem, it is easier to purchase new engines for the B-25 than it is to restore the ones that are on it now. All that remains is to get it finished and get it in the air.
The Yale aircraft, as it's known in Canada, really came along in the late 1930s, I suppose, as a very advanced trainer before airmen went into fighters, etc. It didn't last too long. It was underpowered, but it was used by Canadians in the 1939, 1940, 41 period. And then it disappeared from sight altogether. Fortunately for us, it was just simply a matter of a man approaching us who had stored it in his barn somewhere, and he knew very well that, as we do, that it's an important aircraft in our Canadian context. But the Yale is such an unusual aircraft that simply, I think there's one flying in the world now, none in Canada. And that's why we're anxious to see this project come to completion.
There is also what's left of a Westland Lysander, a light air reconnaissance aircraft used during the Second World War by the RCAF. Canadian warplane heritage found it in a field somewhere in Edmonton, apparently abandoned forever, and they brought it back to be honored with the rest of their collection. Admittedly, it doesn't look too promising these days, with parts scattered here and there, seemingly forgotten. But someday soon, perhaps in a year or so, when the money is there, the Lysander will make it to the CWH active list, and the skies will howl again with a voice that was once so familiar. After their elementary training, pilots judged to be suitable bomber pilot material advanced to twin-engine aircraft, such as the Avro Anson. Canadian Warplane Heritage has this Mark V version. Some derided the Anson in its day, calling it 10,000 aircraft parts flying in close formation. But in fact, it was most reliable. Bomber crews called it Faithful Annie.
The Avro Ensign represents probably a particularly nostalgic period with the RCAF. Ex-military personnel see it and it brings a lump to their throat. Some of the old boys in our group haven't seen one of them fly since 1945, and we hope that this will bring back a lot of memories when they see it into the air in Air Force colors.
A great many of the members were in fact pilots during the war, either with the Royal Canadian Air Force or the RAF. One of those is former RCAF squadron leader Bob Smith.
Well, most of my experience was with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I instructed in Canada before going overseas, and then I flew Spitfires, mostly with Tactical Air Force on the continent. Some of the experience was in England. I flew Hurricanes in the northern part of England prior to going to the continent. But the majority of the effort by Canadian fighter squadrons, anyway, was centered into two wings of Spitfire pilots. There was 126 wing and 127 wing. I was a member of 126 wing, and on that particular wing, I was on two different squadrons, 442 Squadron and 411 Squadron. Both of these squadrons at the time that I was on were equipped with Mark IX Spitfires. Later on, towards the end of the war, some of those aircraft were changed over into Mark 14 Spitfires, which I also flew for a while. Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that amongst the Allied Air Forces, Canadian pilots were considered to be top-notch pilots, and there are many of the top fighter pilots of the Allied Air Forces were Canadians.
The FG-1D Corsair 4. Its masterful outline embraces the cold winter air as it hovers balefully over the ground in proud defiance of the years that have wearied before it.
Our Corsair was produced in the mid-40s, and we acquired it after it had been in storage in the desert for some 25 years. It's an aircraft that's very unique. It was unique in both its looks and in its the wide diversification of operations that it saw with the British Navy and consequently flown by Canadian pilots.
It is dedicated to Flight Lieutenant Robert H. Gray, a steel-nerved Canadian flyer from Nelson, BC, who on August 9th, 1945, single-handedly sunk a Japanese destroyer after his Corsair had already been hit twice. At 50 feet, it was all over. Gray was killed 5 days before Japan's surrender and became the last man of the war to receive the Victoria Cross for valor.
Corsair is my idea of a World War II fighter. The performance is, as you would imagine, I often compare it to a slingshot on takeoff. Enormous acceleration, terrific rate of climb, magnificent control response. As was told me by an ex-World War II pilot, he said, I stopped flying when they took me off Corsairs because there is no other airplane except a Corsair.
The Firefly has proven to be their greatest find yet. It is one of the few, if not the only one, still in flying condition in the world today. And with that, the peculiarities just begin.
It's such a beautiful aircraft now. It was such a sad thing then when we discovered it shortly before its pending demise.
They found it on a farmer's lot in Georgia, propping up a billboard of all things, and destined for the scrapyard. They brought it up to Toronto, then to Hamilton, and over the course of a year or so had it restored to Royal Canadian Navy colors.
We just can't allow them to disappear. Whenever I see the aircraft, whenever I'm in the aircraft, it gives me a great feeling of humility and pride at the same time that I'm involved and that people, fathers, can show their sons these aircraft and say, there, now that's what Canadians used. It's very important. The foundation, if we look back, it's always interesting, it's always exciting to think of the ground covered, but we never want to lose our sense of adventure. To me, the important thing is what's ahead of us. I think it grows even more exciting